Okay, I guess until people get here, I'm just going to talk about a positive historical case for a baseline figure of a historical Jesus existing. And I'd be forming that in terms of historical argument that it would be more likely than not that's saying that the historical position of Jesus Christ existing is more probable than the mythicist position due to the evidence I'm going to present. So I'm going to try to build what I think is a strong historical case for a historical Jesus. I think a lot of people start off with presupposing the Gospels as biased and can't be used to ascertain any historical truth. That's a critical judgment that I think is an error, and a lot of scholars, even critical scholars and atheist scholars, are moving away from. You have to understand that most sources in history were biased at the time, so it's not some criticism that you can levy amongst historians either way. And then you'd be first a priori neglecting some of the earliest biblical sources, which would be historically a terrible thing to do. So I think a good way to start is just to outline, I guess, basically what the gospel traditions themselves outline. What is the minimum baseline that we should shoot for in a historical Jesus, and then move to extra biblical sources. Touch on ancient Greco-Roman manuscript traditions in light of New Testament traditions can be helpful, and I think moving on from there. Hey, Josh, welcome to the Hangout.
Hey, thanks. Glad to be here.
So, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Well, I was just saying I would, like to work with you here. I mean, if you don't mind, I have some resources here.
Sure, that'd be great. Um, what I'm going to present first of all is kind of a little bit of touching on Greco-Roman manuscript tradition and around that time, just to kind of show the superlative manuscript tradition that the New Testament's based on. And I think a lot of people know that, but I think if you look at it in comparison, it can be helpful in light of this argument. So I'm going to do a share screen. Let's see if I'm presenting myself. Yeah. Okay. So here is just a couple collated manuscript traditions for a few writers, contemporary writers to the New Testament: Josephus, Tacitus. Josephus writing in 93, 94 AD, as early as 70. In some of his writings for Antiquities, it was about 93, 94. Tacitus writing around 100. Plutarch anywhere from 75 to 100, 110. Suetonius right around that time. So these are a lot of contemporary writers that be writing in Greek, in Greco-Roman tradition, writing in historical context around that time. So, for example, with Josephus, we derive a heavy portion of Jewish history all the way from, Genesis to the time of Josephus. A lot of people consider that fairly accurate history. That's where we derive most of it from, between Philo of Alexandria's reportings and it was a Hellenistic Jew, I believe, and then Josephus. We gather a lot of what we know about ancient Jewish history, but that are extra biblical or extra Old Testament. So if we were to look at Josephus's tradition of Antiquities of the Jews, he published 20 books, and this was available in Rome around 93 or 94. And they're the books that specifically mention Jesus, John the Baptist, and James the brother are in books 18 and 20. And I'll show you here the Jesus passage 18:3. John the Baptist is 18:5, and the James brother of Jesus is 20, chapter 9. So these are all found in books 11 through 20, which were collated into manuscripts later than when they were produced in 93, 94 in separate books. And then later in line, people collated them, and they were circulated from books 1 through 10, 11 through 20. So specifically what we're looking here is the tradition for books 11 through 20. And what we'll know is that from any of the books 11 through 20, this one contains a book that contains from anywhere from 3 to 15, and this one contains from 1 to 15. So these were different collations from the 11 through 20. These are from the 11 through 20. This is a complete version here that came later. Obviously, it's the latest one in the 15th century. But quickly, if we look at this, we'll notice that the earliest copy that we have of anything from 11 through 20 is from the 9th century. This is Codex Vaticanus, and it's located in Rome. But what you'll notice is since the testimonium passages are located in 18 through 20, and this one stops at 17, this one doesn't count. So the earliest manuscript tradition we have with the testimonium is actually the one from Milan, which is 11th century, and it contains 11 through 20 in the circulated composition. And so this would be, 900 years plus removed from when Josephus wrote this. So what you have is you have 900 years of hand-copied tradition that you can't look back into and see any of the errors. So any of the textual variants or anything, you just won't know. You can't tell. You have a limited scope to know how accurate the tradition is in light of itself. So that's just one, and I could go really deep into this. Tacitus is really late. Plutarch's really late, and if you look at it in light of the New Testament, which I'll talk about in a minute, you'll notice that for the New Testament, it's surprisingly early, comparatively, which doesn't really speak to the truth of anything, but it can definitely speak of one historical requirement that's preferable in all things being equal. So with that, I'll see if Josh has anything to say.
No, I was looking through some of my books, and from my study, it seems that the vast majority of scholars recognize that Jesus, a case can be made that Jesus did, exist, and just from these Josephus quotes, and even though some mystic scholars denied that. Bert Ehrman, in his book, Did Jesus Exist? The Historical Argument for Jesus of Nazareth, I have right in front of me. He really lays waste to those type of arguments. So, critical scholarship, doesn't deny any, that about Jesus by and large from just Josephus's passages about him.
Well, that's cool. I think that's a good thing we should segue into. We'll talk about, first thing I'll talk about is what is a baseline that most people looking to prove the historical authenticity of Jesus, what they should be looking as a historical baseline to prove. And then we'll go into what that is, and then we'll start going into extra biblical sources like Josephus, which I think is an appropriate place to start. So the first thing I'll say is, in regards to a historical Jesus argument, the baseline you want to shoot for, because we don't need to prove he was God or a deity or a prophet or any of those things. Now, you could work historical portraits of Jesus and say he was an apocalyptic preacher or cynical philosopher, anything like that. But really, the baseline that I think is appropriate would be a man by the name of Jesus, which would be Yeshua, Yehoshua, some variant of the English Joshua, that lived in and around Judea, Samaria, um, you know, and was crucified anywhere from like 29 to 34 under Pontius Pilate, and coinciding with the reign of Tiberius. I think with those things, as long as you can prove that there was a man by that name, and you can say he was crucified under this person, Pontius Pilate, under the reign of this Caesar. Okay, and we can seek to prove that historically through historical methodology and criterion, such as obviously multiple early independent attestation. Um, we would also seek to prove these through other historical criterion, like criterions of embarrassment or dissimilarity from earlier tradition or later tradition or something like that. So, and I think we can talk about that. So, with those things said, I think where we can start in a unified manner is by not rejecting the Gospels wholesale, by realizing they are the earliest source, and that not presupposing their inspiration, but looking at them as any historian would do in historical documents. Um, what we do see is all four Gospels are not unanimous in that he was crucified in Jerusalem. He was done so under Pontius Pilate, and they are say who his name was, and baseline agreement about who that character was that we don't even really need to prove. With that being said, if you take into account market and priority and understand that the synoptic tradition is some way related, it wouldn't be four independent attestations, but if you looked at the synoptic as one tradition and you looked at the Johannine tradition as another, you could infer that at least between the two, it's plausible that there's two independently attested sources. And the arguments for the independent nature of John is very easy to prove, because there isn't a literary relationship insofar as they keep a formal structure or borrow heavily from the same exact usages of Jesus' sayings and so on and so forth and keepings. So with that, two sources there, and then we'll move on to Josephus. Josh, do you have anything you want to say?
Yeah, I think from the Gospels we can know a lot. We don't even need extra biblical sources. But with Josephus, I think it's a great, you know, it's unbelievable that anybody would mention a person in that time period. We don't have any mention of anybody from Palestine right in that period. So it's unbelievable that he would mention Jesus. And I think that goes for the impact that people were spreading the gospel, that it was worth mentioning. And virtually all New Testament scholars agree that they weren't making them. They really believed on the basis of Jesus's miracles, like the feeding of the 5,000, which Ben Witherington, in his Christology of Jesus, mentions that as one of the 13 facts that virtually all New Testament scholars agree that we can know that relate to Jesus's identity just from the New Testament manuscripts. So I think this general skepticism to the New Testament is uncalled for, and it's really an anti-supernaturalistic bias against the possibility of miracles.
Yeah, that's definitely a very good point. I think you see that being commended a lot against people that or some secular people that evaluate the claims of the New Testament. Okay, so first, I guess we'll start with Josephus for an extra biblical reference to Jesus' existence. Now, there's some interesting things to know about the Josephus quote, which is often um, historically questioned to be a forgery or interpolation and has signs of Christian tampering. And recently I've done a little bit of looking into this, so I can kind of provide like a decent overview of kind of the testimony of scholarship as people have seen it play out. So first of all, I'll present the quote. Let me see if I can get this on the screen here. Okay, so I'm going to share. Okay, so here is the quote, and I'm going to read it out loud. This is found in the Antiquities of the Jews, Book 18, Chapter 3. It's about 3 sentences down in Chapter 3, or maybe 3 paragraphs down. I don't remember what I meant that annotation to be, but regardless, it'll be close to there. So this is from Flavius Josephus. Testimonium Flavianum is just basically Latin for saying the testimony of Flavius, or the testimony of Josephus. It says, about this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought call him a man, for he was one who performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many Greeks. He was the Christ. And when, upon the accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate had him condemned to a cross, those who had first come to love him did not cease. He appeared to them, spending a third day restored to life, for the prophets of God had foretold these things and 1,000 other marvels about him. And the tribe of Christians, so called. So that's the quote that we have, and that we had for a very, very long time. Now, obviously, if you look here, there's some interesting things. If indeed one not call him a man, he was the Christ. And then there's another interesting stuff down here. Appeared to them, spending a third day restored to life. But if you look here, it says appeared to them. It doesn't say it directly as it says he was the Christ. And if one indeed ought call him a man. So some of this stuff obviously looks to be interpolated. So besides those manuscripts that we now have, what we do have of Josephus, and I'll stop sharing, has been basically quoted throughout history. And the earliest quote we ever had of Josephus was by a early Christian father by the name of Origen. And he's writing in like 230, 250, and he quotes Josephus in, I guess it's, what is the word called? It's Contra Celsum, so against Celsus, who was considered a heretic at the time. In Book 1, Chapter 47 of Contra Celsum, Origen basically says this. Let me see if I can post this up here as well. So there's a lot of information on this topic, and so let's see if I can present this as well. This is the quote from Origen that we have, and Origen was writing, like I said, 230 to 250, and he's writing, this book is called Contra Celsum. It's against Celsum, who was considered a Christian heretic at the time. Origen is an early patristic father that's addressing this particular heresy. And if you look, there's a large passage here in Book 1, Chapter 47. Contra Celsum is a massive, massive work. And he says here, and to so great a reputation among the people for righteousness did James rise, that Flavius Josephus, who wrote the Antiquities of the Jews in 20 books, when wishing to exhibit the cause of why people had suffered so great misfortunes that even the temple was razed to the ground, said that these things happened with them in accordance with the wrath of God, in consequence with what they had dared to do against James, the brother of Jesus. So what he's saying here is, look, even Josephus, who wrote the Encyclopedias of the Jews, said that the reason why the Jewish temple was sacked in 70 is because of the martyrdom of the righteous man James, the brother of Jesus. And then so that's what he's basically saying there in summary. And the wonderful thing is that though he did not accept Jesus as the Christ, he yet gave testimony that righteousness of James was so great that he thought the people that they had suffered the things was because of James. So what he's saying here is, look, he's not, even though he isn't a follower of Jesus, he doesn't accept him as the Christ, he still attributes the misfortunes of Jerusalem by what they did, by all the bad things they did to James. So, but wait, this is interesting because the quote that we have is actually Josephus here saying that he is the Christ. Whoops. Right here. He was the Christ. So whatever this form is, Origen didn't have access to it. So what we seem to have presented here is Origen, whatever he was reading in his version of the Testimonium Flavonium was pre-interpolation. It was neutral. So with that being said, I'll stop sharing. We'll move on to 324 AD. And then this is around the time where another Christian patriarch, apologist, Eusebius, he quotes the Testimonium Flavonium in some of his writings. And that's what we see today. We see the interpolated version that Eusebius quotes. Okay, so first of all, the reason why we think that the Testimonium is interpolated to begin with is because Origen seems to quote a non-interpolated version. Then some 100 years later, Eusebius quotes what we have now, an interpolated version. So quickly to kind of wrap this up, because I could go on about this for quite a while, they went on to speculate which verses, given the fact of what we know about Origen's quotes, and given the fact of what obviously appears to be interpolation just based on best guess, we had certain writers, like a guy named Paul Winters, who in 1954, I believe, he wrote a pretty convincing paper that says, look, based on the Origen quote, based on what appears to be obvious interpretations, I'm going to present what I think is what the neutral form of the Testimonium was before it got interpolated. And so he presents a version that didn't have him saying he was the Christ, didn't have him saying the verse that if indeed he could be called a man, and he just put that out there as being more likely. Well, in 1971, a guy named Shlomo Pines, an archaeologist, he actually uncovered amongst a heap of manuscripts a Slavic / an Arabic version of Josephus that dates the earliest that we have to about the 9th or 10th century. And that one actually reflected what Winter's guess was, which was that it was uninterpolated, so that version reflected it pretty much. The shot was called spot on by what Paul Winters wrote, and that's kind of where we're at now. With that being said, I'll kind of let Josh say something, but I wanted to say one thing that's interesting about this specific Christian interpolation, because I don't deny that there is some interpolation being done here, but I think that there's clearly an argument just on Book 18 and the reference to Jesus that there was an uninterpolated core. But without that being said, in Book 20, there's a passing reference when it talks about James, and it just passingly references very disinterested reference to Jesus, which is even better, I think. We could throw out Book 18, Testimonium, completely and just rely on the Book 20 reference to James, the brother of Jesus, where it makes a disinterested historical reference to James, the brother of the one who was called Christ Jesus. And I think that one is actually even stronger because people don't claim that's interpolated, and it's a passing disinterested reference. The last thing I'll say before I hand it off is that Christians copied Josephus pretty heavily, and we're pretty much the only ones to think for it actually surviving through the manuscript tradition that exists today. And the reason because this was fairly simple. Because of Josephus, he actually was considered a heretic and defector amongst the Jews when he joined the Romans, and his work, Antiquities, was actually circulated in Greek. It was never circulated in Hebrew, and because of the diaspora after the year 70 and so on, Greek became almost increasingly less and less used among Hebrew-speaking Jews, and that amongst them thinking he was a heretic, they didn't see the need to preserve that work as it existed in Greek. However, Christians who were speaking Greek and spreading throughout Greek-speaking places, and all of their earliest scriptures existed in Greek, felt the need to preserve Josephus on accountings that it was a massive historical accounting of ancient Judaism. So they felt the need to preserve that. So that's one reason why A, we even have the work, and B, why it was interpolated by Christians. So that being said, I'll leave it to Josh.
Yeah, I just want to bring up that in discussing the resurrection in doing his PhD, The Resurrection of Jesus, a New Historiographical Approach by Michael Licona, he references John Meyer, okay, perhaps the leading New Testament scholar, who provides 5 reasons for holding that the present text is authentic in its entirety, but he trims it down. And I like that you mentioned that Aramaic, I'm sorry, the Arabic version of the text containing the basic elements without the questionable parts. I think the totality of the evidence is very strong for it being authentic. And again, I say that it's just the more radical skeptics that would deny that, and that is for really theological reasons. It's not historical reasons. Pass it on.
All right, so that's pretty much what I have on Josephus. I'll show you a little bit what I have on my notes here one last time. So in passing, we have 3 references in Josephus's work, Antiquities of the Jews. We have 1 reference to James, the brother of Jesus. This is in Book 20, Chapter 9. We have reference to John the Baptist in Antiquities 18, Chapter 5. And then what's considered the Testimonium, which is in 18, Chapter 3, and that's the one about Jesus. Like I said, even if you throw out the reference in 18 to Jesus here, we still have the passing disinterested reference in 20, which is, so this is the larger entirety of the passage. The bold is the actual relevant verses. It says, Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road, so he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. So, what you see here is just like a passing reference, James, the brother of Jesus. And that seems a lot less disinterested and not considered to be an interpolation, because there's a distinct thing here between saying who was called Christ than the interpolated version, which says he was the Christ. So this is interpolated, he was the Christ, and this one obviously not who was called the Christ. So this is consistent. So when I was talking about the uninterpolated core, this is what the Arabic manuscript reads that was found by Shlomo Pines in 1971. As you can see, it's missing the "if indeed one ought call him a man" reference. It's not here. That's obvious interpolation. He was the Christ is doled down to be he appeared to be the Christ. which is consistent with the other reference in 20. He was called the Christ. And then you'll notice that upon the accusation of the principal men among us is also not found. That seems to be a reference of where Christians would be condemning the Sanhedrin or Jewish people. Not found, not something you'd probably see Josephus do, but everything else remains in the manuscript. Okay, and I told you there's why we think it's interpolated is because Origen is actually in two books, Contra Celsum and Commentary on Matthew, which is what I read earlier, even mentions that he was not called the Christ, which leads us to believe it was uninterpolated. So that's everything I completely have on Josephus. So with that being said, I think we've already established, if we look at the Gospels, Synoptic tradition, the Johannine tradition, we can establish two early independent, multiply attested sources, and then when we add Josephus, we can that becomes three. So now we have three fairly early sources, early insofar as the Markan tradition starts in the 60s to early 70s, conservatively speaking, of course. The Johannine tradition starts in the 90s, conservatively speaking, of course. I think, with that being said, those events are only 30 to 60 years removed, which historically speaking is very, very good compared to the Greco-Roman tradition I was showing earlier. Josephus writing in 93 is contemporary with the Johannine tradition, three independent sources. And then we can talk about Tacitus. What's interesting about Tacitus is, and I was hoping that I invited a few mythicists. I was hoping a few of them would join, so hopefully they will. If not, there's still a few more things I can touch on. But now with the Tacitus reference, what's interesting about the Tacitus reference is the Tacitus reference also confirms it with the baseline historical Jesus portrait that we're trying to prove, insofar as Tacitus, much like Josephus, links Pilate to the situation, and he links Tiberius. Josephus doesn't. Josephus just links Pilate. Now, with that being said, I'll take a look at the Tacitus quote. So if I bring you back, we're already at three early multiply attested sources. Tacitus would become the fourth. That's huge. I mean, that's enough in and of itself is enough for any sensible historian to go ahead and close the book. But I can offer you vast more evidence other than just manuscript tradition that we have. But let me dig up the Tacitus quote really quickly. If you want to say something while I'm doing that.
No, but it seems Tacitus, as he might have had access to Roman archives, and I think that's significant. He usually doesn't. He's very accurate. So I think Tacitus is also a good source. And again, the majority, like you said, vast majority of scholars think Josephus, and Tacitus are good or accurate mentions of the historical Jesus.
Okay, so I'm going to share and I'm going to show the Tacitus quote now. Okay, so here is the Tacitus quote. I have this in a document that I've comprised of like a crap load of extra biblical quotes from year to earliest to latest. Some of these mention anywhere from the movement of Christianity onto like a really solid accounting like Tacitus offers us. So I could offer you a lot of these things, which I think cumulatively can contribute in various ways, but I think ultimately Josephus and Tacitus are the ones I want to focus on. So if we look at Tacitus, Roman historian, I think also a senator, although I'm not sure, I might maybe confusing that, writing around 115 AD. This is the Tacitus quote here, and this is interesting because not only does it link Pontius Pilate It links facts we know about Jesus' death, other independent facts we know about his death, other things we know about his title. It also links other historical facts that we know about Nero. This is a very, very interesting quote. This is found in Tacitus, the Annals, chapters 15, and it's either the 44th sentence or 44th paragraph. I think it's sentence. Okay, so it says, to suppress therefore the common rumor, Nero procured others to be accused and inflicted exquisite punishments upon those people who were in abhorrence for their crimes and were commonly known as Christians. They had their demonstration from Christus, who in the reign of Tiberius was put to death as a criminal by Procurator Pontius Pilate. This pernicious superstition, though checked for a while, broke out again and spread not only in Judea, the source of this evil, but reached the city, Rome also. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to talk about, or actually it might be best to continue sharing so I can point out some things here. Let me see if I can. So, if you look, let's look here. Nero procured others accused and inflicted exquisite punishments on these people that were commonly called Christians. Okay, so here, this reflects Nero's persecution of Christians after the burning of Rome, which happened in like 63, 64, I believe. Nero became out of power in 68, I believe. Fairly sure I got that right. So this is historically accurate to what we know about Nero, to what we know about Rome at the time. Due to the burning of Rome, Nero was basically blaming it on Christians and having them killed in mass. Historically, undisputed. Now, here we have the reference to Jesus. They had their demonstration from Christus. So Christus here would be Jesus' title, which is Christos in Greek, which would be the anointed. It's the easiest thing they can translate into Greek from Hebrew, the Messiah. So Christos, transliterated Christos, not US here, would be the name for Christ. So this is very similar. Can be changed around from language to language, but the consonants are usually all the same. So this, even a biblical scholar, this isn't really disputed. Biblical scholars all across the board, from Bart Ehrman, a secular scholar, to someone like Dr. Dan Wallace, who's a Christian evangelical scholar and PhD in biblical studies, New Testament studies, would agree that Christus is obviously a mention to Jesus, and his title is the Anointed in Greek. Now the next verse, line, who in the reign of Tiberius was put to death as a criminal by Procurator Pontius Pilate. Okay, so now we've linked biblical tradition of Tiberius and the biblical tradition of Pilate from not only the Synoptic Markan tradition, but the Johannine tradition, also linking Pilate with the Josephus tradition, and now following that up with the Tacitus, putting all of this into light. Okay, so with that being said, that's a really strong historical case. Just there, I could stop there, and most historians of sound mind would just bang the book shut and be done with it. Okay, so we have. I'm going to stop sharing. We have, at this point, cumulatively, we have 4 multiply attested early independent sources, being the Synoptic tradition, Johannine tradition, Josephus, Tacitus. Okay. Josh, do you have anything you want to say?
No, only that Gary Habermas also goes over this, and F.F. Bruce before him, especially F.F. Bruce. He was very well respected, but so is Gary Habermas in the field. N.T. Wright also uses a lot of the historical scholarship that Gary Habermas has done on the extra biblical parts. He doesn't really focus on the existence of Jesus. That's a pretty much given. especially from Josephus and Tacitus. And I really liked all the things you've said, and I think it shows. I looked over one of my sources, and it said again that he's regarded as one of the most accurate Roman, officials, historians ever. So I think that really speaks to the credibility of what he is saying. Not likely to just report things that he is hearing, but possibly has even access to the Roman archives, which I think is significant. I'm hoping that you get to the. I think he talks, about the resurrection or the event. That it's implied that way. A lot of scholars have looked on it like it's talking like that, and I think that's very significant. But I'm done.
Sorry, Josh, what did you say you thought was very significant right at the end there?
He mentions and a most mischievous superstition. I know a lot of scholars have talked about that, maybe referring to the resurrection. Thus, checked for the moment, again, broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. He's comparing it to evil because, as you know, resurrection was different from, a lot of the reincarnation or, just naturalism or not existing after death of or disembodied existence of some of the various strands of Greek thought. So he's probably referencing the resurrection, the revivification of the physical body, which was in stark contrast to the Greek or pagan notions of immortality. Paul even discusses that in Acts 17, in how it was contrasted with the Stoics and the Epicureans. So I think it's very significant that he goes out and mentions that most mischievous superstition, and it's probably to the resurrection.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with you there, and that's one thing I wanted to segue into here in a little while, talking about historical arguments for the empty tomb and possibly for the resurrection. Another thing I wanted to say, which I think could be ultimately valuable, is in terms of making a historical case for Jesus. Now, given that we're making a cumulative argument, we've already argued for 4 independent, multiply attested sources. I'll also would argue that we can also take Paul as a reference to the historical Jesus. Now, given I know that Paul never met Jesus while he lived and only saw a vision of Paul, however, I won't be referencing Paul. I'll be referencing a meeting of Paul with other eyewitnesses, namely people that would definitely be able to reference Jesus in a very strong way as being a historical person. Now, Paul would definitely be presupposing this as a matter of fact. At least evidentially, it would be more probable that that would be the case. So obviously, I'm going to be appealing to what we have in Galatians chapter 1 and chapter 2, appealing to where Paul went to after his conversion on the Damascus Road. He didn't go straight into Jerusalem. He went and walked around the desert for 3 years, and then he went into Jerusalem and spoke with Peter and James, the brother of Jesus, for 15 days, uninterrupted, and he basically, which is very, it is we have Paul talking to James, the brother of Jesus, and Peter, who are obviously, I'll make a case for them being the same James and the disciple of Jesus, Peter, that we find in the New Testament tradition, and why evidentially this would be more likely than it just being some other people by that moniker. So first of all, we'll notice that the epistle to the Galatians is one of the earlier epistles. This is thought to be written anywhere from like 50 to 52. And this is a very earlier work, considering that that's when the composition of the writing was to take place. However, he's speaking of events that took place years earlier. So with that in mind, we need to place the Damascus conversion of Paul about, I think, Gary Habermas and other critical scholars, given the establishment of the early churches and given Paul's writings and their considered date, we'd have to put that conversion about 3 or 4 years removed from the death of Jesus. So if we're putting Jesus' death in 33, there are arguments that it could be as early as 30. But just presupposing the date of 33, that would put Paul's conversion no later than 37. If we're presupposing a date of 30, it'd be no later than 34 in such a case. With that being said, that's reflecting very, very early material, which again is, all things being equal, is historically better than not. So with that being said, he mentions going and speaking to James, the brother of Jesus, and he also, in this passage, I believe, Josh, does he use the Greek word hysteresis? And if so, I'll let Josh tell you a little bit about that, how that's, there's some interesting arguments to be made in and around that word and what that implies with the conversation between Paul and James and Peter.
Well, yes, in Galatians 1:18, I believe it is, Paul uses the word hysteristai when he's talking about when he went out to Jerusalem to meet, I believe it was James and John. And hysteristai can mean like an investigation, and that's probably what Paul was doing. He was probably having a historical investigation. I do remember this quote. It's a widely known quote in New Testament scholarship that this liberal scholar, well respected in historical Jesus studies, I could find it. He says, based on Paul going up there into Jerusalem to speak with James and John, he says it's probably fair to say Paul wasn't there to discuss the weather with them, but was probably there to ask questions. And that's probably where he got his information, or a lot of his information about Jesus, or probably to, affirm it or verify it. Probably he got the information even before then, before it went up to Jerusalem initially. And that's probably where the 1 Corinthians 15 quote comes from. So it's probably within 3 to 5 years the 1 Corinthians 15 quote comes from. And so all that information is verified, and even critical scholars acknowledge this. About his vision, some scholars aren't so sure if it was purely spiritual, or maybe it had a physical component, because in the book of Acts, the various people around him could see something or hear a voice. It's probably that there was some auditory component or some physical component. It may have been an objective vision as opposed to just a subjective vision in the mind, and that's probably what Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, with that list of appearances, mentions his appearance, or Jesus' appearance to him at the very last, to give credibility to his statements to being somewhat on a par with the others, even though it's at the last. So he appeared last of all to me. Now, the New Testament does indicate, and Paul does indicate this too in 2 Corinthians, and I believe also in 1 Corinthians, that visions of Jesus, that like they could keep going, but appearances would stop. There was a difference. Paul understood that there was a difference, and so do New Testament scholars by his writings, indicating that somehow that they stopped, and that's why he only lists some of the appearances or who Jesus appeared to. And he said, last of all, he appeared to me. So that's when the appearances stopped. But we can't say that the appearances prior to Paul were, immaterial or something based on the immaterial or the non-physical elements in Paul's vision. It might have just been an objective non-physical appearance, or it may have been some type of physical appearance as testified by Luke, description of the three appearances to Paul, or the one appearance described 3 different times. So I think that there is a good case to be made for the appearance to Paul, for that this is eyewitness or very close to it, if not an eyewitness. He's certainly in contact with the eyewitnesses. So I myself know Gary Habermas. I've talked to him about this. And yeah, it's all on sound foundation. Pass the mic.
Thanks for that. I think you made a lot of really good points. If specifically in reference to 1 Corinthians 15, specifically talking about how that probably relates to what was being spoken about between Peter, Paul, and James, that's recorded in the book of Galatians chapter 1. I think you gave an argument for why that creed is considered to be very, very, very early, and amongst New Testament scholars, they believe so, for valid reasons. I'll give some of that argumentation is basically that what we have in 1 Corinthians 15, the paraphrase is, what we see is we see a formulaic creedal statement that seems to keep the same pentameter when you look at it in the early Greek. So it seems to keep the same. It's not a rhyming structure. It's more of a structure of how the verse basically is spoken in a certain manner. And what you'll notice is it says basically that Christ was buried and rose according to the scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter and least of all me. But let me see if I can pull up this quote in 1 Corinthians 15, and I'll show you some of the positive arguments for why it's considered a creedal statement, and then from there we could formulate why this creedal statement most likely predates even Paul's conversion. So give me 1 second. Let me see if I can find it.
Yeah, the creed is an easy to understand Jewish, the way of communicating creeds, communicating things for easy memorization. You can see that when it keeps repeatedly using and that, kai, the Greek word. And based on that, based on the style of it, this is, some of the various reasons why New Testament scholars affirm the historicity of the creed. It's in a non-Pauline style, okay? And he even says, he received this material and he's passing it on. That's that type of Jewish.
Yeah, it uses a lot of that kind of Jewish terminology. I think that Gary Habermas was arguing where in the beginning where it says, "For I delivered unto you first of all that which I received." It basically is drawing on the tradition of how in Jewish tradition they would pass things on to one another, and so this obviously seen to reflect. Could reflect what we see in first chapter of Galatians. But why most people think that it's a creed is that basically it used the words "and that" repetitively. It says that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, and that, and that, and it uses those two things to say to keep it in a formulaic structure, and then it repeats the word according to the scriptures, according to the scriptures. So it reads out very formulaic, which Josh said is a way that they could use it to remember it. And if you read it out in a way such as if you read it out like this, Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures. No, hold on. That Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, and that he was buried and he rose on the third day according to the scriptures, and that he was seen by Cephas and the 12, and then so on and so forth. It makes it easy to remember and seems to be a creedal statement. Now, with all of that being said, you could argue on that basis that this creedal statement could possibly, given it's already present here in First Corinthians, which is another very early letter, it's talking about what he's received, which could go back to the 3 years. So could go back to the meeting between Paul and Galatians chapter 1, which would be if Paul's conversion was 3 years after the death of Jesus, this would be 6 years. So this would be plus 6 years after the death of Jesus that this creed would be passed on to him. So this creed possibly, or most likely, predates even Paul's own conversion. So this creed is very, very, very early. So that's an interesting thing that Josh brought up. With that being said, I can make an evidential case for Peter and James basically being the same people who would be considered to be James and Peter the apostle within the Christian tradition. So first of all, it seems as if Paul is presupposing this as a matter of fact. Not only that, but it coincides with early patristic and apostolic, or I guess we'd say patristic tradition, and it also coincides with biblical tradition, that these people would be in place at that time. So we do know, according to apostolic tradition, according to early patristic tradition and according to the biblical tradition, that James and Peter were in Jerusalem church after the death of Jesus. And now I wanted to bring up one historical criterion known as the criterion for embarrassment. You'll actually notice that Paul in Galatians chapter 2 and throughout some of his works talks about arguments he had against specifically Peter. And so what we see is Paul's writing about the same Peter, and he's also meeting a historical criterion of embarrassment that he could have left these things out if he was going to make them up, but because they're rather embarrassing that they would be arguing in this light. But he meant it for reasons of theology, and he left it in because it's most likely true. So that being said, is obviously that it presupposes that this is the James who held influence in the early Jerusalem church. And obviously, according to the tradition, James was killed martyred in Jerusalem, I believe, and Peter and Paul were both martyred in Rome in the mid-60s. So with that being said, so let's recap very quickly. So we've presented 4 independent sources for multiple independent attestation being the gospel tradition, synoptic tradition between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, another source being the Johannine tradition, another source being Josephus, another source being Tacitus. So that's 4 early multiply attested sources. Then we've also brought up the early reference from the early 50s of Paul talking about meeting with James, the brother of Jesus, who were eyewitnesses of Jesus, which is an early work talking about a secondhand testimony of people talking to eyewitnesses, which not only is confirmed through the biblical tradition, it's also confirmed through the early patristic tradition as well. And also, Bart Ehrman made an argument that a lot of these, give me a second, a lot of these manuscripts and early epistles are circulating in or around Antioch, Syria, which is a very short walk from Jerusalem, and Paul would have no reason to lie as to the historicity of James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul being high up historical figures in around the Jerusalem church, and I don't think any historians or scholars dispute the validity of those claims. So with that being said, upon the 4 independent sources, I've also linked Paul writing very early and also speaking to eyewitnesses that knew a historical Jesus, meeting historical criterion of embarrassment and so on and so forth. So that in itself is a very, very strong argument. Now, if we were to add other very tertiary arguments, such as the fact that early Jewish tradition and polemics never disputed the existence of Jesus, they always disputed that he was some magician or he was his body was stolen from the tomb by the disciples. They never argued that he never existed. His existence was always presupposed, even from the very earliest. Some of these polemics could be reflected in the Christian tradition of the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 28, where basically we see the argument between the Jews saying that the disciples stole the body, and the Christians answering that they couldn't because there was guards there, and the Jews counter-arguing that the guards fell asleep, and so on and so forth, to account that all the time the polemic, if at the time the Jews were arguing that he didn't exist, and they were in a very early time in and around the place to know, then that polemic would actually reflect it. It wouldn't say, well, you stole the body. It would say there was no body to steal, but you don't see that. So if you add that as tertiary evidence, if you add the fact that in the Talmud, Yeshu was considered to be a heretical, influential, basic priest or so on and so forth, rabbi that gathered some followers under heresy, you could add that as a potential source. And I'm just throwing stuff out there at this point. I think given all those things cumulatively, I think, and there's plenty of other things to be said. I think William Lane Craig argues from the very earliness of the pre-Markan narrative that the pre-Markan narrative reflects material that was independent of Mark itself and is earlier than Mark's tradition, and that material presupposes the historical Jesus, and could also be, since it's in the Passion narrative, it also seems to reflect a historical Jesus in that respect. So, Josh, is there anything you could add as like tertiary evidences for their historicity of Jesus besides what we've mentioned so far?
Only like a number of professional historians, like Pinchas Lapid. He was a Jewish historian. Okay, he remained Jewish throughout his life, and he said on the basis of the evidence, he would have to conclude that God had raised Jesus from the dead. That's Pinchas Lapid. He's no longer living, but people out there should look it up. Various criteria, as Shamos mentioned, multiple attestation, dissimilarity, embarrassment, Semitic traces, context and expectation, effect, principle of embellishment, coherence, historical congruence. There's so many. that a number of historians, like Michael Grant, the secular historian, has viewed the Gospels very favorably. So has well, I can mention others, but the vast majority of scholars don't buy into this pagan parallel stuff. That died down in the early quest for the historical Jesus, and it's been dead for over 50 years at least. So there are no reputable mystic scholars writing on this. It's like trying to, pardon the pun, resurrect a dead horse. That there simply are none, and liberal theologians of the past argued against all these contrived alternative explanations for the resurrection. I'm thinking of Schleiermacher and David Strauss and a number of others. So I think we have every good reason to believe in the resurrection of Jesus and no good reason to think otherwise. I'll let you go.
Yeah, I think this is a good time. We can touch on some of the arguments for the resurrection and for the empty tomb and stuff. One thing that I'll say here, I'm flipping through a book that I have. It actually contains information that's kind of relevant to what we were just talking about, and insofar as why the verse in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is considered to be a creedal statement. And this is from biblical scholar Ralph Martin. And he says there's several telltale marks that this is an early creedal formulation. He says this. He says the fourfold that, and he has that in quotations, the use of the that 4 times introduces each member of the creed in verses 3, 4, and 5. The vocabulary is unusual, containing some rare terms and expression that Paul never employs again. So this would reflect that this isn't something that come from Paul. If it uses terms that he never used, this is obviously a creedal statement formulated from someone else, not Pauline in origin itself. The preface to the section informs us that Paul received what follows it in the next sentences as part of the instruction, and so on and so forth. He says, possibly things through his contacts with churches at Jerusalem and at Antioch or Damascus, altogether representing a very early tradition. So that's some of the things we could bring about in reference to that. Let me see just really quickly what else we got here. It's talking about patristic conclusion. Yeah. Okay. So I think with all of those things, those are some pretty healthy arguments for historical Jesus. And then, I mean, obviously, that's just us presenting the evidence. And obviously, the evidence is why the modern scholarly consensus on the subject is that the historical Jesus existed. And it's because of the preponderance of evidence. As Josh said, there's a very minority position, basically only being propounded by 2 scholars with credible credentials in the field, one of which, Richard Carrier, has a PhD in classic history and classics. You might not even be able to consider that, and in history, you might not even be able to consider that. But I think we should give that a pass. Robert M. Price has a double PhD in biblical studies in the relevant field. But besides that, the host of historians and other biblical scholars absolutely disagree with the conclusions. And if you look at a lot of their arguments, which I may address at another time, because I just wanted to give the positive case here for the historical Jesus, we can talk about some of the evidence that the mythicists use. Yeah, so now I guess it'd be cool. We can talk about some of the resurrection arguments, specifically arguments for the empty tomb. Okay, so this is kind of interesting. I think, first of all, a lot of people that are interested in the resurrection arguments in contemporary scholarship would be like Gary Habermas, Mike Licona, and there's one other guy that I can't remember off the top of my head that's been really pioneering, or not pioneering, but leading the charge in this school of thought. But I think ultimately, there's a lot of evidences that can be used to show that historically it's very, very probable that the tomb, even though it's controversial, it's very, very probable that the tomb itself was empty, and it can explain more things in and of that counting than the tomb not being empty or there not being a tomb, so on and so forth. So uh, let's talk about the tomb itself. Was Jesus buried in a tomb? Right? That's one of the necessary things we would have to prove in order for the tomb to be empty, I suppose. So let's talk about Joseph of Arimathea, who he was, what he did, historically what we know about him, how many sources we have, um, what historical criterion does that particularly meet. So Joseph of Arimathea was a Jewish man existing and around the time that Jesus was crucified. He's considered to be one of the judges on the Sanhedrin, a very influential Jewish man at the time. Uh, he's only written about in the gospel tradition, but you wouldn't expect a reference of Joseph of Arimathea existing or making it through in manuscript form. Relative nobody, even though he's an influential and he's a Sanhedrin. If we look at this in perspective, Josephus, he wrote pretty much the most that we have in Jewish history. He didn't go off naming the name of Sanhedrin judges very often. He did name a few specific points. He doesn't do it very often. So he left out many of them, and because he wrote over a large period of time when that council was in effect. So with that being said, since he left out many names of Sanhedrin at specific points in history when it was in effect, we could expect him plausibly to leave out Joseph of Arimathea. So the fact that it's only accounted in the Gospels is not a knack against it, historically speaking. And historically speaking, what we do know about Joseph of Arimathea is that it's present in all four of the Gospels. So if we're going to presuppose Markan priority again, we can notice that I'm drawing from the Johannine tradition and from the Synoptic tradition, saying that there's at least two independent sources for Joseph of Arimathea, which is more than one source, and it's very, very early, and it meets historical criterion that I'm going to name now. So one historical criterion that it meets is criterion for embarrassment. Why does it meet the historical criterion? Well, first of all, what is the historical criterion for embarrassment? Historical criterion for embarrassment is very kind of a complicated rule of thumb to assess general reliability of historical sources, but it usually says something like this. If a work is forged, they're more likely to leave out embarrassing criteria, right? The forger, if all the things in it are just non-accountings of truth and they don't need to keep in line with truth, they can more accurately reflect the author's intention than something that does have to reflect the truth. So what that's saying is a forgery is most likely to not have embarrassing criterion because he could just edit those out. He's in no way bound to reflect embarrassing criterion, as he's in no way bound to reflect anything that's true. He's just forging it. It's doing an account for completely different reasons. However, the person that's trying to keep an accounting in accordance with historical truth or fact is bound by at least keeping some things that were true, factually true historically. So and some of those things could be embarrassing criterion. Now, they could also leave those things out and still keep true to the other things historically, but leaving them in basically shows that it's more important for them to be included because it happened historically. And they were left in, they're embarrassing, but they were left in accountance with the fact that these things are specifically embarrassing and were left in due to the fact that they reflect truth. Okay. Now, that's just a general rule of thumb and one historical criterion. It's used often in the New Testament, amongst other things like multiple attestation, dissimilarity, shorter readings, harder readings, readings that in textual variants that are more likely to account for all of the rest, and so on and so forth. But what we see with Joseph of Arimathea, why it meets specific historical criterion of embarrassment, is it's embarrassing for the Sanhedrin of Judges to condemn to condemn Jesus to death, and then for no reason, completely made up because it's a lie, to reflect one of the Sanhedrin judges in a good light. No reason for them to do that. The only reason for them to paint a Sanhedrin, they're more apt to paint a Sanhedrin in a bad light because of what happened, right? But if it was true that Joseph of Arimathea did do right by Jesus, and now then it would be left in, even though it's an embarrassing criterion, because it was true. Now, there's some interesting things to note here, insofar as a lot of people argue that, well, look, the custom wasn't necessarily to bury these people in tombs. A lot of times they would either rot on the cross or just bury them in a mass grave. Well, look, if Joseph of Arimathea was a Sanhedrin judge, that makes a special case for why he would be taken down, why he wouldn't have been put in a mass grave, why Joseph of Arimathea would have been given the right because of his high station and Pontius's ability to want to appease them. If you look in the Gospels, Pontius Pilate is trying to appease the Jews the entire time. He's obviously trying to, at least by a dumb and ineffectual ruler that he was at the time, he at least had enough sense to keep on the good graces of the Jews as best he could in some situations that just, were at least permissible, that he thought. With that being said, I'll stop for a second and see if Josh has anything he'd like to add.
Well, I appreciate that. I just wanted to add, there's a number of other little, lines of evidence a person could give. One that I really like is the discovery of the tomb by women, and I think that's a good argument because of the low status of women in ancient society, Near Eastern society, and I think it's really an argument for it. I mean, and also think of this: the 1 Corinthians 15 creed, okay, does not mention women. Okay, it does not mention women, but the Gospels were written later do mention women. Why would they mention women unless the women's story is probably historical? So in that case, the Gospels are probably historical. If we're gonna be honest, we're gonna say, there wasn't like an evolution, to get the women out of the textual historical tradition. No, the women pop up in the Gospels discovering the empty tomb first. So they weren't trying to make something up, obviously. If they were, they would put Peter as the first discoverer of the empty tomb. Men, not women. So both the 1 Corinthians 15 creed is historical, but an extra argument for the gospel, the historicity of the Gospels, at least the discovery of the empty tomb, is because women and their low status is highlighted in the Gospels. And I think that's a big hurdle that skeptics simply can't get over. Next.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with you that Josh is bringing up the fact that in the Gospel accounts, we have the women going to the tomb and finding it empty. And what he's noting is in Jewish culture, women's testimony was taken as lesser of a man. And so if this meets a criterion for embarrassment insofar as if it was a forged accounting and the forger was trying to imply the truth of the testimony or getting you more apt to accept it, he would obviously, if he's not trying to keep an account of something that's true and he can bend it to his need, would not have women going to the tomb. He'd have someone like Peter or a bunch of men going to the tomb. It's much more reliable, especially if his goal is not to reflect truth, but rather to impart belief upon having you believe what he's saying. But the reason why it wasn't presented in such a way, and it would have been more compelling for men to find the tomb, but it wasn't presented that way, it was presented that women found the tomb, is the fact that it probably reflects some amount of historical truth, right? Which would reflect that insofar as the tomb being empty, that was more likely true insofar as it meets at least one historical criterion of embarrassment, which is very strong in its own measure. Um, there are other things to think about too. I think Gary Habermas, in one of his lectures, brought up something called the Jerusalem effect. So first of all, I'd like to kind of highlight what we've kind of talked about so far. We've talked about, um, first of all, the multiple attestation between the gospel tradition and the Johannine tradition of Joseph of Arimathea actually placing Jesus in the tomb. We talked about that meeting some criterion for embarrassment, that they have no reason to paint one of the Sanhedrin in a good light, in light of if it was made up in light of the fact that they persecuted and killed Jesus, and if in fact it didn't happen. Um, you know, Josh has made some really good points as well in reference to that, and I think that ultimately, when we're talking about the resurrection, Josh brought up the fact that the women finding the tomb is also very powerful insofar as it meets the historical criterion of embarrassment and seems to reflect an accounting of historical truth rather than some embellishment to get you to believe it for some reason or other. Now, keeping in line with what we've said so far, we're building a cumulative case for Jesus' tomb being empty and thus the resurrection. I think another thing we can imply is that something called the Jerusalem factor. And I think this is best accounted for the fact that if Jesus' tomb was not empty, and what we know about early Christianity after the death of Jesus is that James and Peter were running shop in Jerusalem very, very early. We noticed that there was a Christian presence in Jerusalem all the way up until the sack of the Second Temple, and then a Christian presence in Antioch from before that and on after, which was very, very close. So we've established those things in particularly. Josh, do you, in light of anything I've said so far, do you have anything you want to interject before I go into the next point?
No, I think you summed it up good.
Okay, so the Jerusalem factor is usually thought to be if I can prove that the Christian tradition was early in and around Jerusalem, had a lasting effect there up until the fall of the Second Temple, what we'll know is that if Christians were actively claiming that Jesus' tomb was empty, they wouldn't be able to make that claim in Jerusalem if the tomb wasn't empty. That they would just say, no, he's rotting in the tomb right now. Obviously, everyone knows it. And it would actively be able to be refuted by people in Jerusalem that would know that to be a falsehood, especially if it was disseminated very, very early.
For the past month, I always archive everything.
Within like 3 years.
And I'd like to get you in a hangout.
Whoops. Especially if it was disseminated very, very early within the tradition as well. So, yeah, with that being said, it's more likely that these guys, that specifically the tradition, sorry, I lost my place there. Specifically that the tradition of them saying these things would be more likely than not, given the fact that they could easily be debunked if they were said early in or around Jerusalem, which I made an argument that these things, Christians did have a presence in Jerusalem, and these claims were being made very, very early on and would actively be able to be refuted, and would be very, very hard for Christianity and the church in Jerusalem to get off the ground in that period, which we don't see any evidence for historically, which would be another reason to prove that the tomb was being empty and that the resurrection most likely happened. Another thing that I think we could talk about, and I could get Josh to help me with, is the belief amongst the early disciples that of the post-resurrection appearances. Yeah. Hey Jim, welcome to the broadcast.
I'm not. Are you there, Jim?
He might be having some mic problems.
How are you tonight?
Oh, hey, good.
Hmm.
I just wanted to bring up another point, and that point would be the early disciples having experiences of the risen Christ and actually claiming they've seen Jesus rise from the dead. And I think these things are very, very important, especially if we can take these things in light of a minimal facts argument where not only do we have the earliest disciples thinking that Jesus rose from the dead and experiencing that, but we also have two hostile converts to Christianity. We have James, the brother of Jesus, who seemed to think during Jesus' lifetime that he wasn't the Messiah, and he would be one of the people to most actively know, denied him for a very, very long time, and then became a convert to Christianity. Also, Paul, who was a Pharisee, son of a Pharisee, in a very high up position, cush position, persecuting early Christians at the time, was being basically groomed for the position. He had a very profound conversion experience where he had no reason to do so. In fact, it was actually worse for his life, his conversion, because if he would have not converted, he would have been able, not been persecuted, not been martyred. He would have been just able to keep that position, and his life would have been much, much, much easier on him, but he chose not to. So I think when you look at it in light of the fact that most scholars believe that the reason that explains and accounts for early Christianity is the fact that the earliest disciples did seem to experience him risen. And I think Bart Ehrman has like one of the most epic quotes ever on this. And some things, Bart Ehrman, we're going to disagree on, obviously, but other things I think are super, super interesting. And here's one of the quotes here that I think Bart Ehrman me and him would be in agreement on, and it talks about Jesus' disciples believing that he rose from the dead. Give me a second. So here's the quote, and I'm going to read it to you. And this was in Bart Ehrman's book, How Jesus Became God, on pages 140. And it basically reads like this. It says, "There can be no doubt historically that some of Jesus' followers came to believe he was raised from the dead. No doubt whatsoever. This is how Christianity started. If no one had thought Jesus had been raised, he would have been lost in the midst of Jewish antiquity, and he would be known today as only another failed Jewish prophet. But Jesus' followers, or at least some of them, came to believe that God had done a great miracle and restored Jesus to life. This was not a mere resuscitation, a kind of near-death experience. For Jesus' disciples, Jesus was raised into an immortal body and exalted to heaven, where he currently lives and reigns with God Almighty." Bart Ehrman goes on to say, I say, quote, some of his followers, because it's not altogether very certain as to all disciples became to believe this for reasons I explain. But he later goes on to say that it's obvious that some of the followers definitely think that he did rise from the dead, and this obviously explains better than the contrary the accountings for early Christianity. Do you have anything to add there, Josh?
I got by memory also one of the most well-respected German New Testament critics, Gerd Ludemann. He says that it must be taken as historically certain that the disciples, the early followers, experienced appearances of Jesus alive after his death. That's a paraphrase. I have the quote somewhere, and it's virtually unanimous that New Testament critics believe that they experienced appearances, that the disciples experienced appearances of Jesus. You have they're also presented as physical, both in the Gospels and in Paul's writings. You had some liberal New Testament critics like Bultmann that deny the physicality of that Paul was talking about physical appearances, but that was because of his Hegelian dialectic in liberal theology. Basically, no one adheres to his approach any longer. You also have many of the appearances in 1 Corinthians 15 corresponding to specific appearances that are mentioned or highlighted in the Gospels. And I'm thinking of the appearance to Peter in 1 Corinthians 15. Well, that's mentioned in Luke 24. So Luke, he knows the appearances tradition, and so he knows what Paul experienced, had physical elements in his second book, the book of Acts, which the majority of scholars think that they were combined, the Gospel of Luke and Acts. So I think we have good, overwhelming evidence for the appearances. No scholar denies them. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting, and I think that some really bad arguments that I've heard, and Josh will probably laugh at some of these, but some really like unlearned critiques will say, like, you'll hear stupid stuff like this. They'll say, well, the Gospel of Mark really doesn't have any of the resurrection appearances or really any resurrection, and that's the earliest gospel. So therefore, they can infer some preposterous thing from that. But there's a few things to be said here. It's true in the Gospel of Mark that if we're considering the textual variant that begins in Mark 16, verse 9, and lasts through verse 20, is considered to be basically a later redaction in the textual tradition.
Yeah.
Well, we'll notice that even in verses on chapter 16, verses 1 through 8, it says, and Jesus has risen. Okay, so the resurrection is firmly stated in Mark. Okay, it would be an error in judgment to say that the resurrection isn't featured in Mark. So it does say, and Jesus has risen. But another interesting argument is if you talk about the formation of codices and the fact that most likely the gospel books were circulated in their communities amongst their various traditions, and then probably later accumulated much later, like into various accounts together, like we see in I think it's 170 Tatian makes the Diatessaron, which is the Gospels all harmonized together, and so you'll see that a lot later. But what you'll notice is early they were probably circulated as individual works, and then a codex is like a modern day book. There's been arguments that the last verse or the last page of the codices, which or the codex, which was circulated in the early version of Mark, possibly could have been lost because the first and last pages are the easiest to be lost. And so there are arguments that the long ending to Mark could be authentic if, in fact, it's based on the fact that the last page of the codex was lost and then copied whatever copy that they're using to make that particular copies from then on out was made from a subsequent copy of the lost codex, which is an interesting argument for the authenticity of the long ending to Mark. And there's other tertiary arguments that could be added to that. But even without that being raised as a particular point, even in the authentic verses 1 through 8, we still have that Jesus has risen. We still have in Mark that he claims that he will rise. And so I think obviously that's enough there to debunk some bad arguments like that. Josh, do you know any others you could speak of?
Yeah, he definitely anticipates the appearances in Mark and anticipates a whole thing going up to Galilee. So, there's a number of that, but I just think the totality, like when you look at all the appearances, And in First Corinthians, you have an outline there that corresponds to the Gospels, and Acts, the book of Acts, also. So they're not disjointed; they correspond in some way. To Peter in Luke 24, to John. There's the empty tomb also does. But for the appearances, I think we have, you can build a case with Mark, but I like to use Mark, 1 Corinthians 15, and just various pieces of evidence.
Yeah, I think with all that being said, that's a lot of the things that I wanted to touch on tonight. There was one other thing that I wanted to touch on, which would be like the dating of some of the Gospels, but I don't think that's necessarily important, because I think historically the things that we've talked about so far are. I want to end the broadcast kind of soon, the live portion, but I think that in summary, we've pretty much outlined a couple different areas tonight. One area being like positive case and evidence for the historical Jesus and what that baseline is, what we need to shoot for, what the case, the positive case and the evidence looks like. Then we went on to touch on topics such as the resurrection, the empty tomb, and arguments for that, and arguments for the disciples' experience of resurrection. We've argued about historical criterion that helps shore up those arguments for the tomb being empty and the resurrection. So I think I'll try to recap as best I can, because we've touched on just a crap load of data tonight. And as much as we've wanted to, this stuff can be expanded exponentially even deeper than what we've went into. And there's a lot of scholarship behind this, and a lot of things that need to be assessed openly when you come to these historical conclusions. And I think with all that being said, we've touched on, in conclusion, four multiply attested independent traditions that link the baseline historical Jesus, which is what we want to shoot for, with being a historical person. So speaking rather quickly, the baseline we want to shoot for historically is not any portrait of Jesus or this or that he was deity or that he was resurrected. Historically, we just need to prove that he was a man that existed. But there's certain things that we need, without being very vague like that, we need to be more specific on who and what this man was. One of the things that we could say is that he was crucified under the reign of Pontius Pilate and the reign of Tiberius Caesar, and that he was named Jesus, and he was killed for heresy. And what you see is, when we use that as a baseline, we can not only confirm that with the gospel tradition, but many, or at least two extra biblical sources, strong extra biblical sources, in Josephus and Tacitus. So as a whole, it presents itself as the Markan tradition, the Synoptic tradition, attesting to historical Jesus being crucified under Pontius Pilate and Tiberius. We have the Johannine tradition, which is independent of Mark, early, and also saying that he was killed under Pilate and Tiberius. Then we have Josephus linking him not to Tiberius, but to Pilate, and since they coincide, they almost imply each other. And then we have Tacitus not only linking him to Pilate, but also Tiberius. So together, that's four multiply attested independent sources in and of itself. Now, from there, we added tertiary arguments of Paul in Galatians, basically speaking, using the word hysteresis, and build a semantic argument for why what he spoke about with Paul was probably things like Josh said. They weren't talking about the weather, they were talking about the historical Jesus, and they were obviously talking about it in terms of like a passing on information, in terms of oral tradition, and in terms of inquiries such as a hysteresis and a historical inquiry. And Josh made an argument for why what they probably talked about then reflects early creeds that even predate Paul's conversion, such as what we find in 1 Corinthians 15. And if you keep all of those historical evidences basically in line with the fact that, no people, early proponents, questioned the historicity of Jesus, and that basically the Talmud never questioned the historical Jesus, and we have very, very early material. I think all these things together can be made a very positive case for historical Jesus. And as we move on to the other topic that we talked about, the resurrection, we talked about how Joseph of Arimathea is multiply attested between the Synoptic tradition and the Johannine tradition. It meets a criterion for embarrassment that they would not have made a Sanhedrin judge look in a positive light unless he really did do right by Jesus. It meets that historical criterion Josh talked about. The women going to the tomb meeting the criterion for embarrassment, because if it was a lie or a forgery or embellishment, it's much more valuable if you're looking to convince someone to put the men finding the tomb, but rather they put women, not to convince them, but rather because it actually reflected historical truth, and that women would obviously be given that role to do anyways within Jewish tradition. So with that being said, we talked about like a lot of the things that contribute to the minimal facts argument by like Habermas and Lacona, and all of the tertiary argumentation that supports the apostles' experiences of a risen Christ and the conversion of James and Paul, and why these were very resistant conversions, and why taken cumulatively the resurrection would be, abductively would explain these events better than some naturalistic accounting. And I think as long as you're not in the business of presupposing a priori that miracles can't happen, then you'd have to take these things into serious consideration. Otherwise, you're just engaging in a priori fallacious reasoning, and nothing I could say or no historical amount of evidence would ever be able to convince you otherwise. And I'll leave it there, and if Josh close this thing out for us, brother.
Well, I just want to close with we've seen good evidence for the resurrection, but I think also we can say a few things about the self-identification of Jesus. He wasn't just a man just doing miracles, but got a huge following where people were some were both learned and unlearned, different walks of life. So things that can be known about him is his use of the phrase the Son of Man, that has theological connotations of the divine king, basically God. At his trial, he's claiming something that is divine. His feeding of the 5,000, his independent approach to the law. Well, who can change the law? Only God can. His ability or saying that he can forgive sins, is calling 12 disciples, showing that it represents the 12 tribes of Israel. Well, who is Jesus? He's the one who calls the 12 tribes together, even the lost tribes. So I think we can say a lot about Jesus. In the words of Wolfhard Pannenberg, one of the greatest New Testament scholars alive today, he's a theologian, a German New Testament scholar. He says the resurrection of Jesus takes on such great importance because it's not just anybody who's raised from the dead, but it's Jesus of Nazareth who's raised from the dead in vindication to his own claims of divinity and his own. So I think on the basis of the evidence and who Jesus was, who he claimed to be, and who others claimed who he was and what he did, that we can put a firm foundation in Jesus as our basis for life and the reason for our hope that we have.
I think that's very, very well said. And in closing, I'll just leave you guys with this fact that Christians have always maintained from the very dawn of Christianity that the claim of Christianity has always been a historical claim. It's never been merely a spiritual claim. We've always claimed these things historically. We've always claimed that Jesus was a real man. We've always claimed that he actively lived on this earth and did miracles. We say historically, he was, crucified, and that he historically rose from the dead, and that the tomb, as a matter of historical fact, was empty, and that God did intervene in history and showed himself through his Son in a great way, and did something very great by Jesus Christ. And so when we're talking about historical Jesus and an empty tomb and resurrection as a matter of historical fact, we're not playing fast and loose with history. This has been the Christian claim ever since the beginning. Yeah, that's the last thing I'll say. If you have anything you want to say in light of that, Josh, we'll close it out.
I think that's done. It was a good broadcast, and thank you very much.
All right, thank you. God bless everybody.